Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the LEAD Center's webinar on self-guided discovery, helping people discover their own path to employment. My name is Rebecca Sale, and I'm Project Director of LEAD Center at National Disability Institute. Instructions for listening to the webinar today. The audio for today's webinar is being broadcast through your computer. Please make sure your speakers are turned on or your headphones are plugged in. You can control the audio broadcast via the audio broadcast panel. If you accidentally close the panel, you can reopen it by going to the Communicate menu at the top of the screen and choosing Join Audio Broadcast. If you don't have sound capabilities on your computer or prefer to listen by phone, please dial in at the numbers provided. Real-time captioning is provided during this webinar. The captions can be found in the Media Viewer panel, which appears in the lower right-hand corner of the webinar platform. If you want to make the Media Viewer panel larger, you can minimize the other panels like chat, Q&A, and/or participants. We encourage you to submit questions during the webinar, and there'll be time at the end of the webinar for us to respond to them. Please use the chat box or Q&A box to send any questions you have during the webinar, and we will direct the questions accordingly during the Q&A portion. It gives you the option of sending it to all panelists if you want all of the panelists to see your question, so you have a choice there. If you're listening by phone and not logged into the webinar, you may also ask questions by emailing questions to Aramide Awoshika at aawosika@ndi-inc.org. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and the materials will be placed on the LEAD Center website at the link that's provided. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box to send a message to the host, Aramide Awoshika, or you may also email her at aawosika@ndi-inc.org. For those of you who may be new to the LEAD Center, we are the National Center on Leadership for the Employment and Economic Advancement of People with Disabilities. We're a collaborative of disability, workforce, and economic empowerment organizations led by National Disability Institute with funding from the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. Our mission is to advance sustainable individual and systems-level change that results in improved competitive integrated employment and economic self-sufficiency outcomes for people across the spectrum of disabilities. And our website link is on this slide. We're at leadcenter.org. There are lots of great resources, and we'll talk about some of them as we go through the presentation. We will have a welcome later from Christopher Button. She's a fabulous partner in our work on customized employment with the Office of Disability Employment Policy. I wanted to briefly introduce today's speakers. We have Bob Nemec, who is Senior Consultant with Griffin-Hammis Associates. Bob has served as Director of the Minnesota Employment and Training and Technical Assistance Center and was Director of the Employment and Community Supports for Community Involvement Programs in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he led the transformation of a traditional day program into a high-quality community employment service. Bob has provided training and consultation services in 41 states and 2 Canadian provinces, as well as assisting in the planning and facilitation of employment first events in many states. We also are joined today by Chantel Brown. Chantel is the Business Services Coordinator at the Central Arkansas Planning and Development District, CAPPD. They are the one-stop operator for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act programs. They cover the central Arkansas area, which consists of 6 counties, and she's worked in the workforce system since 2001. Nancy Buteau, unfortunately, is not able to join us today, so we unfortunately won't be able to hear from her. What we're hoping to cover today is to enable webinar participants to learn about self-guided discovery strategies and the critical role of facilitators, explore the uses of self-guided discovery to support customized employment, I'm sorry, I was distracted for a moment, to support customized employment outcomes. Participants will receive and review materials and resources related to self-guided discovery, and we're releasing today with this webinar a self-guided discovery facilitator's manual, and we'll discuss the populations that will most benefit from self-guided discovery, from cross-system collaboration opportunities, and talk about the experiences of some of the places that we've used it, and in particular one of the pilot project demonstration sites where Chantel will give us some information. Lead Center has been piloting self-guided discovery for the past couple years. We had a competitive process a little over 2 years ago where states competed to be demonstration sites, and we required that it happen as a cross-system effort that involved the workforce system, vocational rehabilitation, and other partners. So in some cases it was community colleges, behavioral health, state agencies, developmental disabilities, centers for independent living. So depending on the state, there were different partners involved who piloted self-guided discovery. So you'll hear from one of the pilot sites today. So we wanted to spend just a little time, for those of you who may be less familiar with discovery and customized employment. We're just going to take a couple minutes to give you some of the context, and then we'll let Bob talk specifically about self-guided discovery. So discovery is the first step in customized employment. It focuses on finding out who the person is right now and delves into their interests and preferences, their skills and contributions. Discovery helps people learn what they do well and how those skills can link them to employers who would value what they have to offer. It helps people learn about the conditions of employment that will enable them to be successful. So some people, their schedule is very important because they wouldn't do well if they had to work very early in the morning, or if they needed to work someplace that was extremely quiet, or needed to not report to more than one supervisor. So discovery helps to figure those things out. And it uses what it learns to match job seekers to the needs of an employer. One of the exciting things is that with the introduction of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, for the first time there's been a definition of WIOA, of customized employment in law, and customized employment in WIOA is defined as competitive integrated employment for an individual with a significant disability that's based on an individualized determination of strengths, needs, and interests of the individual. It's designed to meet the specific abilities of the individual and the business needs of an employer, and it's carried out through flexible strategies. There are 3 kinds of discovery that we'll talk about briefly. Facilitated discovery is the one that most people are familiar with, and that's the process that happens one-on-one for people with significant disabilities. Group discovery, or what Lead Center has been doing, is guided group discovery, brings together a small group of people to go through the discovery process together with the help of a facilitator. And we've been using guided group discovery in a lot of different systems with youth, with people with developmental disabilities, with people who use the services of Centers for Independent Living, with veterans. So we have a number of pilots that people in the behavioral health system that we've used guided group discovery with, and at the end of this PowerPoint there's a link to a facilitator's guide and information about that. And self-guided discovery is the one that we're going to focus on now, and we'll talk some about who these different processes might work best for as we go through the presentation. So what Customized Employment seeks to do is to take people away from the traditional job search strategies that compare people to standard job descriptions and to other job candidates. And you see on the slide, you know, what we typically do to assist people in traditional job development. The customized approach seeks to circumvent that by focusing how a person's skills meet an identified unmet need of an employer. The assumption is that employers are always hiring, and as long as the potential employee brings value to the business, that there's an employment opportunity there. Customized employment uses discovery to identify people's interests, strengths, and ideal conditions of employment. It also relies on the use of informational interviews to collect information about employer needs. And once a need is identified that matches the job seeker's interests and conditions of employment, and they seem to have a fit, a proposal can be made. So it removes the job seeker from a traditional comparative process, and the employer only has to decide if this one particular job candidate can meet one or more identified business needs. And who benefits from customized employment? And it really is, the answer is everyone. It really is a universal design. It's something that has been successfully used for people with and without disabilities, with any type of barriers to employment, anyone who is having trouble figuring out what that next step is or what a good match might be. So customization is not specific to disability, and a wide range of employers and job seekers can and are using this approach. And we have been promoting the use of discovery and customized employment with American Job Centers, with vocational rehabilitation, schools, and other workforce development partners, and really encourage those systems to work together, that it provides a useful initial assessment of skills, contributions, and conditions of employment. It identifies the supports that people need and the partners that can be brought into the process in building a person's network. It promotes the braiding and leveraging of resources across systems and leads to successful outcomes for everyone involved. The materials that we're releasing today include a self-guided discovery facilitator's guide, helping people discover their own path to employment. And the guide focuses on the skills and competencies that facilitators should have and the things that facilitators should think about, and Bob will go into detail about that. The guide also has 3 appendices, and it includes the initial Griffin-Hammis self-guided discovery manual, customized employment planning tools for individuals and families. It includes a workbook on developing vocational themes, and Appendix C has an employment toolbox that has a number of different forms that you'll find useful. And there's a link on this page to how to get to the manual. It's available for download and is fully accessible. And with that, I really would like to turn this over to Bob Nemec to be able to talk about the process and the what he's been doing in using it over the past couple of years and what he's learned. So, Bob, take it away. And you may be on mute.
I'm not.
There you are.
Hello?
Now you're not.
Okay.
Okay, we got you. Thanks.
Okay, all right. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for being on this webinar and for your interest in self-guided discovery, which is actually a misnomer. It's really not self-guided; it's minimally guided discovery. What we believe is that really nobody can do this alone. That it really takes it takes a group of people, or at least you need to have some allies that can give you advice that might see the world a little differently than you do, and can bounce ideas off you and also generate ideas. So, but the difference in where self-guided sort of emerged and why we started thinking about it was I was working with a number of people who are on the autism spectrum, and what I learned was that a lot of the folks, not everybody, but a lot of the people that I was working with were pretty smart. They're pretty intelligent. Some of them had college degrees. Some of them had some kind of specific technical skills. And what they were running into was where they could apply them, you know, and that it was even going to schools and colleges and technical schools, sometimes we don't really see all the various places where you can apply a set of skills or a particular knowledge. Like, for instance, somebody who might be a chemist. I don't know how many schools or how many chemistry departments are encouraging chemists to go into the brewery business, for instance, but yet they hire chemists. And so we're trying to find places where broader than kind of the most obvious places where people might find employment that takes advantage of their skills. And so for those folks that we were dealing with, and we're also doing a fair amount of Griffin-Hammis, we're doing a fair amount of work with veterans. There's just some folks that don't need to have their hand held in every step of the process. That if you give them something and ask them to kind of complete a form or complete a set of questions, they're going to be able to do it. Whereas in a more like directly guided or facilitated discovery, where you might be working with someone who doesn't have complex language or doesn't verbal language, for instance, or might have a harder time grasping concepts, it's different. You know, the steps are the same, but the interaction with the facilitator is different. And so we started thinking about, well, how could we sort of take what we know about guided discovery and modify it in a way so that it can be done individually, you know, with help from a facilitator or a guide. And also another group that we really looked at, and was one of the first groups of people that we kind of vetted our ideas with in our first drafts of the self-guided workbook, which is one of the appendices in the facilitator's manual, were parents of people with disabilities. Because we started thinking about how my history is as in the provider world. I spent a long time in the provider world as a director, you know, as a direct service person, I mean, you know, the whole gamut. And in particular, in the last couple of years that I was a director, you know, we would see young folks come to us out of transition programs, and they didn't have a whole lot of preparation, you know, so we tried to get to people as early as we could, but a lot of times, you know, somebody would show up in June, or they'd be referred in June, and there we were. Or maybe somebody transferred over from another program, an adult. And so to do discovery with somebody, you know, sort of in that situation, as an adult service provider, you're really under the gun to get it done quickly, because people expect to get a job right away, and they really want, you know, I mean, your time is compressed, and you know, you have to kind of do things in a pretty quick order. So we started thinking, well, if we can get this to families, to the parents of young people who are at a relatively early age, and I'm not even talking about 14 or 15, I'm talking about even earlier, their process of discovery can take 5, 6, 7 years. And so as people start to understand, like what are the things that you would want an individual to know, a person to know, or to learn, or to expect, so that by the time they become 16 or so, which is when most of us got some kind of part-time job to do something, and you started on your employment career, they have a better idea of what to expect and also where to apply their skills. So so that was the other group, folks that you know, that are families of people who have disabilities and young folks, and they can take that you know, can take time to do it. And then there's actually a whole other group of people that is really everybody, and Rebecca said that, and it's not a you know, a frivolous statement. It's true, everybody. I mean, I've used that self-guided workbook with a friend of mine, you know, who was laid off when he was in his 50s, and you know, was stuck. What am I going to do? And so here, check this out. Write these things down, and then let's talk a little bit about it. Maybe we can, you know, figure something out. And you know, and pretty much anybody that I know who is telling me they're looking to make a job change, I give them this book, you know, this handbook, and say, take a look at this, you know, and see what you can do. And so it really does have that sort of application. And this is not the first, you know, like we didn't just invent this thing. It just didn't pop out of thin air. There's been a long progression of this kind of strengths-based assessment and movement for a long time. I mean, if you've ever read the book, What Color is Your Parachute? I mean, I think I ran across that thing almost 30 years ago or 25 years ago. And the process that he uses in that book to kind of get your act together, to kind of figure out, you know, what you're good at and where not, it's the same stuff, you know. It's different, but it's the same principle involved. And you know, it's been going like that for some time. In the world of disabilities, we started out in the early supported employment days, where, you know, which sometimes I'm, you know, like to say, well, yeah, I was there at the first part of supported employment, and you know, in many ways we were just kind of lucky, but you know, we talked about career planning, that we're going to do career planning with people as one of the essential steps of supported employment. And then we realized that, you know, most careers are accidental. Nobody really plans them, and so you just have to get places where you gain experiences, and those experiences give you insights as to what you're good at and where you like to be, and you know, those types of things. And you know, and so it's a process. It's a really dynamic and developing process. So that's sort of the, you know, sort of the short Cook's version of the evolution to get to the self-guided discovery. So what I'm going to tell you a little bit about today is I'm going to go back and just give you a tad more information about customized employment and the pieces of customized employment, and then talk a little bit about you know, again, the discovery pieces. But I also want to share with you some of the ideas and insights and experiences that I've had with people in making this work. And so the Facilitator's Guide is, so I'm going to jump to that, which is something that you will be able to download. And the Facilitator's Guide it's really loaded with a lot of information, and I think there's really two parts to it. The third part being, you know, sort of appendices and forms and things like that. But part one is just this notion about facilitation, and what are some of the sort of general ideas and principles that people who facilitate things consider. And was able to incorporate information and insights from, like, my friend Carrie Griffin, who I work with, about facilitation, and some of my other colleagues, and we sort of put it all together. We also talked about, in the Facilitator's Guide, a set of values and principles that you know, came to me as someone who was working with mental health programs with another provider agency here in St. Paul, Minnesota, and that mental health director is a senior RAP facilitator. So I don't know if you are familiar with RAP, but it's the Wellness Recovery Action Plan. And she and I started talking about how there would be some real crossover with RAP and self-guided discovery. I kept thinking that, you know, peer support specialists would be the perfect, you know, kind of guides to help people in the mental health world through this, as opposed to professionals, because there's a sort of an inherent distrust of professionals, you know, among people who experience mental health issues. And so that's sort of how we started. And so she went through discovery training with me, and I went through RAP training with her. And I was very impressed by the whole experience. But one of the things that got me right away was that in the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, there is a set of values and ethics for RAP. And I thought, wow, you know, we don't really have anything like that for discovery. So what if we modified? What if we took, you know, sort of the format that they produced and said, well, how would you say that in discovery terms? And so there's a set of values and principles, and we'll go through some of them because there's like about 16 or something. I think I only picked about 8 or so to go through, but they're all listed in that Facilitator's Manual that you'll be able to download. So, okay, so the Facilitator's Manual really kind of talks a little bit about facilitation. It gives you, you know, sense about kind of even creating your own kind of value statement about what you believe in it, about it, and we'll get into that just, you know, a little bit. Then the second part of the Facilitator's Manual is about the steps in the process that, you know, the self-guided workbook, which is one of the appendices, really takes you step by step through the process. And, you know, it's a workbook. It can be, you know, filled out. A lot of people, I think we you know, offer some worksheets in the toolbox that is something that, you know, I've run into a lot of people that don't want to mark up their workbook, and so they like to have other stuff as well. So we're just trying to give people as many resources as possible, you know, to help them along on the process. So the second part of the Facilitator's Manual kind of goes through step by step some of the things to consider, some of the things to watch out for, some of the landmines that we've discovered, or rabbit holes, if you will. You know, you can get stuck. And so that's that second part. And then the third part, as I mentioned before, is just a treasure of resources for you to to use, or at least lead you to other resources. So that's what that's all about. One of the things that I think is essential. I mean it's not even essential. It's almost like sacrosanct, and that is that I don't think anybody should try and facilitate discovery with another person unless they've done it for themselves. I mean, I really believe that strongly, and you know, I guess I didn't used to believe it, or it didn't really dawn on me until I went through RAP, and I realized that people who facilitate RAP have done RAP. They have their own plans, and so I was doing the first commingling workshop with the folks at Kaposia here, and as I was going through it, I went through RAP, and I've been there with this group of people for 3 days, and then started to do the self-guided discovery on the final 2 days. And we got to the point where we were creating themes maps, and I will show you one themes map as we get through this. And you know, people were they're being very diligent, doing their work and all this, and someone in the group said to me, "Well, aren't you going to do one?" And it was like a bolt of lightning hit me. I went, "Oh my gosh, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I have no business talking to you about this unless I show you me, you know." And so that really started me on this notion that you really need. I mean, it's hard to be able even to understand why you're asking a question, why you're pursuing a train of thought related to trying to elicit information to put it all together. If you haven't done it yourself, you don't really know what it means. And so I'm staunchly, you know, in favor of that. And in fact, now when I do extended training, when we're doing the full-blown customized employment training, 1 day of that training is people doing self-discovery. And, you know, and it's compressed. It's only one day. It's not like taking out over, but still gives people this insight. And the feedback from the folks that have gone through it has been pretty amazingly positive. They go, wow, I didn't really, I get it now. I understand it. So anyway, so I'm just throwing that out there. So let me jump into customized employment. Can move on through here. It doesn't matter what kind of employment you do, you're going to do four things, right? You're going to have to do some sort of an assessment. In the world we typically, that I grew up in this field, was the vocational rehabilitation world, where we called those things evaluations, right? And evaluations, the root word of evaluation is value, which means that in some way we are affixing or assessing or adding determining a value of a person, which, you know, I can't do that. And so, but you still need to have a starting point, and assessment is a starting point. And then after assessment in the employment world, typically follows then the job search, right? And I think we've conventionally called that job development, which again is a misnomer, because the only people who have really ever developed a job is the person who owns the business, right? We as people who go and talk with businesses are prospectors, you know. We are farmers, we are investigators, we are trying to, and we then help that individual who runs the business come to that decision to develop or create a job. So we're, you know, that's the role we play, but we're connecting businesses and people is what we're trying to do. And then we have employment supports, and in the supported employment world, we used to call those job coaching, and job coaching is an employment support, but it's not the employment support. And then the fourth phase is always, it has typically been ongoing support and hopefully ongoing career development. Well, the flaw in that process is that those four steps conventionally don't have much relationship to the others. There's kind of individually discrete pieces. And so essentially after an evaluation, that evaluation would go to a job developer, and the job developer would look at it and go, you know, there's really much I can do with this, so I need to kind of start again. Because the evaluations really don't direct people to where to do this. They just sort of take a snapshot of who the person is. So now this job developer is starting kind of almost from scratch again. I got to figure out who this person is. And then again, what we have done conventionally, and this is one of the differences in customized employment versus some of the other more conventional ways of doing it, is that we're not looking for available jobs. We're really trying to find out who the person is, and then we go out and find out where they're going to fit best, right? As opposed to the way it used to be, and you know, I used to do this, which was somebody would say, hey, so-and-so is hiring, and they're willing to hire somebody, and then come back to the program and we go, well, who have we got? You know, so we're doing it backwards. We're sort of backfilling it. And then finally, the employment supports were typically, we really thought about employment supports almost after the fact. You know, someone gets a job, and then we go, well, how are they going to get there, and what do they need, and all those sorts of things that happen after a job was secured. Again, not necessarily relating to the evaluation, not necessarily even relating to the job development process, and sometimes not necessarily relating to the individual job seeker. So, job coaching and employment supports were, again, sort of happened on spot. And then the final piece of ongoing support was always, like in the provider role, who's going to pay for it? You know, how are we going to be able to do this? And there really wasn't a whole lot of time devoted to the notion that the first job is probably not the last job. I mean, there's like 350 people on this webinar right now, and I would bet that almost none of you are in your first job, that everybody's in a job now 4 or 5 or 6 removed or however. You know, I am not painting curbs for the city of Hammond, Indiana right now, you know. But oftentimes we don't let people with disabilities do that, right? I mean, everybody's on this webinar has probably said this at one time in your life, where you said, when you're working and you say, well, I'll do this until something better comes along, right? I mean, that's sort of the way we've been brought up to think that we always can do something better, we can always get a better job, we can make more money, we can whatever it is. Folks with disabilities don't get to do that. We don't let them. You get them a job, and you're supposed to be in that job, and if they lose the job, they go to the bottom of the list, and you all know this, right? So anyway, so what makes customized employment different and really interesting is to me, is the notion that it is a dynamic process. And if you see the circle there, I've renamed these pieces. Well, we call discovery at Griffin-Hammis Discovering Personal Genius. And what's beautiful about it is that discovery is like one of the only, the Discovering Personal Genius is one of the only methods that I know that actually give you the names of places to go and talk and do job development. Discovery also identifies sort of the general employment supports that somebody needs. I mean, you find out about like what kind of transportation does somebody need, or are they a day person, are they a night person, do they have medication that needs to be attended to, are they, they need particular kind of clothing or whatever. So you can't anticipate everything. Some of those, you just can't, but you can anticipate the general things, and those general things about like transportation or time of day or those kinds of things, conditions, really direct the job development. Instead of the job development happening, and then you try to figure out how to support that. So that's what's great about it. And then we get onto so I talk about then cultivating those employment supports. I think that's a much more organic way to think about it. That they're out there. We just have to discover them and cultivate them. And sort of help them grow and help them develop. And then when someone does get employment, we need to engage those supports that we've talked about, and then identify additional ones and engage those as well. And then the final piece being ongoing support and career development. The concept that most people want to advance in their employment careers. Some don't, but most people do. And so what's our plan for that? And so what makes this process really so fun to me and so exciting is its dynamic quality, that it really it doesn't do it. Well, that each piece is interconnected. That you can't just pluck one piece out and do it and expect it to work. And that's one of the things that we see happen a lot is that people go, well, we're going to do discovery, but then we're going to go do conventional sales job development. Well, there's no point in doing discovery if we're going to do conventional sales job development. They're integrated, they're connected. The other thing that happens is that the personal profile that is developed for the individual and by the individual is a dynamic thing. Like you are dynamic beings, right? You change all the time, you grow, you encounter more things. And so I may have a personal profile that's helping direct me to a business to conduct an informational interview for potential employment. And maybe it doesn't pan out, and that's okay because there's other places. But I've learned something about that individual that I didn't know before. Or that individual has learned something about him or herself that was previously unknown to them. So that changes the profile, right? And that's one of the things that like I've found that sometimes folks in the system, like the VR system particularly, but not just them, have a hard time with. If they take is that coming back and say, well, we have to change that report because Jim is different now than he was 2 days ago. And that really is sort of disruptive to the whole thing. So anyway, you can see that it's a completely dynamic process. So discovering personal genius really has these pieces to it, and I'm just going to briefly talk about them, and you'll find them in much more detail in the booklet and all. But the personal profile is sort of the story, right? That's the main difference in customized employment versus almost all other forms of employment. Methods of finding employment is that customized employment is designed to answer the question, who are you? I mean, who are you? What makes you tick? And we all see that when we're in those jobs that meet a lot of the conditions that we have, that we perform better. I mean, everybody, you perform better at stuff you're interested in. And we've all done jobs until something better comes along that you weren't particularly interested in, and you weren't really high performers. So we're trying to create a personal profile, and that's what the discovery will do, is help you do that. Next piece is about establishing financial goals, and I cannot stress how important this is. And this is one of the other reasons why we try to get this into the hands of families and parents at an early age, so they start thinking about what's the financial future for your son or daughter or your loved one. What's that look like? Because everybody on this webinar, I would say, considers it. Everybody thinks about how much they earn and what that does for them. How much you earn determines where you can live. How much you earn determines what kind of a car you can have or how you get around in general. How much you earn tells you about whether or not you can go on vacation somewhere, or what kind of clothing you can buy, or where you shop, or all those things are determined upon how much you earn. And so one of the questions, again, getting people kind of thinking in terms of that. And if they're on Social Security, for instance, to get a benefits query. If they're on veterans benefits, to kind of get an assessment of what their veterans benefits are and how they get affected. That's really an important piece. And start thinking about how much do you need to earn in order to sustain a lifestyle that you are comfortable with. And so it goes back even to one of the primary questions that we used to ask all the time. And so I plead with you, please don't ask this question to people. Don't ask them what their dream job is, okay? Because that dream oftentimes becomes a nightmare. And the deal is, I don't know what mine is. I know the conditions. I get paid a lot and I don't do anything, but I haven't found any of those yet. So, but I found jobs that fit me pretty well. This one fits me pretty well, and I perform pretty well at it. And is it the last job I'll ever have? I don't know. It's pretty good right now, and I'm okay with it. And it allows me to live a lifestyle, to support my family, and to do some things that we like to do to enjoy. So I cannot stress again. And now I think the next webinar that you guys are putting on at LEAD is about financial planning. So I would highly recommend that doing that. The next piece is skills, and it's skills that others would find useful. And I think that's a really important piece because I can't tell you how many times I've run into this where people have written a report and they'd go, well, Jim is really, really good at computers. And my response is, doing what, right? Well, and playing video games, I don't know who finds that useful. I guess there might be somebody, maybe I'm an old guy and I don't know, but so my question would be, can he create an Excel spreadsheet? Can he do Photoshop? Can he create a Word document? What? Can he do a PowerPoint presentation? What do you use the computer to do that is functional that other people would find useful? And so, we really focus on that. And we really divide it in two categories. One of them being, what do you know how to do? And to know how to do things is going to involve your hands. So like, I can plant a garden, I can do that. I can build a stairway because I have some carpentry skills. I can do that. And so whenever you think about skills that you know how to do, it's going to involve your hands or some facsimile of your hands. And then there's what do you know about? Now, most of us, when we started our work life, we didn't get hired because we knew something. We got hired to do something. And again, when we started our work life, we got hired to do something, and we learned how to do it when we got to it, right? We didn't have a whole lot of prerequisite skills, although, again, growing up, I had to mow the lawn, I had to clean the house, I had to, rake the leaves, I had to shovel the snow, I had to do the dishes. I had all these skills that were building up in me, none of them that I necessarily ever used in employment, but again, they taught me to learn how to do things and so I got started out by doing those more manual physical kinds of things. But some of the folks in self-guided discovery are going to have they might have a master's degree. And so what they know is going to be useful to somebody, as opposed to a 17-year-old kid, who's coming in the senior year in high school. There isn't much that I know that somebody's going to hire me for. They're going to hire me to do something. And so, again, we want to break those into those two things. And then the next pie is called ideal conditions of employment, and we've talked a little bit about that. It's like, what are those things? It could be time of day, it could be environment, it could be hygiene, it could be interaction with people, it could be distance from home. It's all kinds of pieces to it, and it's almost a never-ending list. And so, it's another great piece. And then you'll find that there's this piece here called review. And this is one of the things that people, whether they're doing guided discovery or self-guided discovery or whatever, don't do enough. And that is stop and take a breath. You know, that you have to stop and reflect on what you're doing. How's it going? You know, am I on the right track? Does this make any sense? And so it doesn't take long, but it's really an important piece. And then in our world, in the Griffin-Hammis world, we direct all this to what we call vocational themes, because it's our belief that themes are much larger and hold many, many more jobs than job descriptions. So as an example, I would say my father was a mechanic. That's what he did for a living. And fixed cars, fixed trucks, he did all that kind of stuff. But he really lived in the world of automotives. He lived in the world of machines. You know, he lived in the world of fixing things. And so if you start with those, you figure out, well, what are the places where people fix things, and what kind of skills does he have in fixing that would fit the fixing places? It's a much bigger palette, and it creates a heck of a lot more opportunity, because most people will say, well, the economy is tough, our jobs are few. Something I learned was that only about 10% of all available jobs are ever posted publicly. So, you know, so that means that everybody's, you know, scrambling around at this 10% and ignoring the 90%, because business is everywhere and people are hiring all the time, but they hire for only one reason, and that reason is it's going to improve their business, right? It's going to help them make more money, which is not a bad thing. It's just what people need to do in order to sustain a business. So we do step 2, which is cultivating employment opportunities, and we do something called creating a list of 20, which we create a list of 20 places where that theme exists. And so if you do it with 3 themes, you have 60 places. That's a heck of a lot. And you can do it in small communities as well. You know, we schedule informational meetings, we conduct informational meetings, and during those informational meetings, the idea of whether it's a wage employment, meaning working for somebody, or it's self-employment, doing it for yourself, will sort of emerge. Employment supports, kind of conventional stuff like clothing, instruction, tools and equipment, transportation, job analysis. Those are the usual things that we think about. They're not the only things. And then the last phase being ongoing support and career development, which involves, you know, like a consultation, touching base with people, and then career advancement, and then you're always enriching the profile. So that's sort of the pieces of it. Now I'll move into this notion of values, because I think this is really important. And I picked up about 8 of them that I thought were really poignant ones. I mean, they're all really important, but these 8, I think, are the killers. Each stage supports the process. In each stage of the process supports the premise that there are unlimited ways in the world to make a living, and there's a place for everyone to make a contribution. Again, you know, we only know what we know, but there are all kinds of things out there. All people are viewed as employable and can make a contribution to the economic well-being of a business. Again, very important. This 3rd one is critical, and that is guidance from a discovering personal genius or a discovery facilitator. It does not mean control. In our field, we don't like to give up control. And, you know, it's like sometimes people will say, well, they have choices. Yeah, but we reserve the right to make the decision. And so control is really important. Taking with that the individual must be the key decision maker and agrees to take action on their plan. There's unconditional acceptance of each person as they are. We don't try to make somebody be different. We take them where that person is and start there. Also, that it's understood that each person is the expert on him or herself. I am the expert on me. Really, I am. You know, and you are the expert on you. And so so again, in the self-guided world, that becomes really important. It becomes important whether it's self-guided or not. But in the self-guided world, it kind of, the onus changes to the person. Our focus is on strengths and not on perceived weaknesses or deficits. You know, I can't tell you how many times I read reports or get conversations with people, and they start out by telling me what they can't do. You know, I'm sorry, I never went into a job interview telling a potential employer what I can't do. You know, I talk about what I can do and what I'm good at and my good qualities. I don't tell them about my weird little idiosyncrasies. And finally, that no paths of discovery, no two paths will be the same. And it's one of the pitfalls that you see, that if you start finding that your discovery pathways start to look similar for two people, you're not doing your job. You got to go back to it and make sure that they change. This picture right here of how we arrived at vocational themes, and again, one of the appendices, one of the resources that you have in the Facilitator's Manual is something called the Developing Vocational Themes Workbook, and it helps get you to this. Now, this is not the only way you can do discovery and customized employment. There are other ways to do it, and they're, you know, perfectly valid ways to do it. We like this way. I've been doing employment for people with disabilities for now 38 years. I like this one the best, okay? But that's my opinion, you know, but I've gone through all of them and I've done all this various stuff, and I think this one is the one I like the best. And I also don't believe it's the last one. And so the challenge I throw out to 388 people sitting on this webinar is, if you take this, make it better, right? Find out, make it better, and improve the total you know, bulk of knowledge that will help somebody else do this, you know, pass it, pay it forward in a way. But so what you have, and what you'll find in the manual, in the various resources, is how do you get at this, right? We talk about personal attributes, which are important, and we talk about interests, and they're important. They're not enough, right? I'm interested in golf, but I am no good at it, and so being a golfer is not in my. It ain't gonna happen for pay. I mean, I can go golfing, but I'm always going to pay me to golf. But I'm still interested in it. I mentioned talking about what do you know how to do and what do you know about. We also jump over to tasks performed, and for folks who have never been in employment, this is kind of an important piece. We kind of look at you know, chores and things like that. What do you know how to do with it? But you know, for somebody who's got a master's degree in you know, nuclear science, you know, their tasks performed are going to be completely different. I don't need to see that person make a peanut butter sandwich to know that they can make a sandwich, because it's irrelevant to what they're doing there. But I still want to try to get at what are the things that you do? What are the collection of skills that you do? Conditions for success, conditions for employment. I already talked a little bit about that. Contributions being like, contributions, it really is how you interact with other people. So for instance, let's say if I go to this particular church and before the church service, I have to put out hymnals on the pews. Not only is that something I'm doing as a skill, but I'm also contributing to the community. I'm contributing to the well-being of that community. So we look at things like that. And then that last one up there says it's discovery activities. And those are really kind of trial balloons where you're looking and saying, like, you know, I think this might make some sense. Let's go try it. Let's go see if there's a place where we can try doing it. Anyway, as that information comes from the individual, it boils down into that funnel, and that funnel says, like, habits, trends, and associations. And what's cool about that, what's really, I think, interesting about that is you create a map like this. I mean, physically a map like this, and being able to see it, literally see it, is so much more effective than trying to imagine it. And so I might not see an association. I might not see a trend or a connection. But you might walk by and go, hey, did you see that? Because your perception of the world is different than mine. And so that's, again, why you can't really be alone to do this, because you'll only see the world through your lens, and you're going to need a couple other lenses to see it as well. Anyway, so we try to identify 3 vocational themes, and those themes lead to what we call unlimited possibilities. And we believe in the world being abundant and not being scarce. You know, bountiful and abundant is way better than scarce, you know. And so then the next step really comes into, once you have themes and you have these possibilities, where do you get support, and how do you get it, and who provides that support? And so one of the challenges that we all have collectively is how do we build the capacity to support people without taking control, you know, so that they can move along their paths of discovery. This is a photograph of a themes map that a young guy did in a self-guided course that I did a couple of months ago, and he was a real interesting fella, and he kept asking me, do I have to follow this format? And you know, and my answer to him was, no. This is the self part of self-guided discovery. Right? You do what you think you need to do, and he created this amazing thing here. And this was only part of it because he had this flip chart paper taped onto a you know, like a big whiteboard that spanned half of the room, and he went on the whiteboard. And so you can see, I mean, right there, you can tell a lot of things about this fella, right? I mean, obviously, you can tell he's Jewish. Well, that was really important to him. And you know, he had just a lot of these different things. And what I wanted to show this to you is to illustrate how powerful an image can be and how much information it can provide. Because if I'm following this in a linear fashion and I'm reading page after page after page, and I have to try to make sense out of it, it's harder to do. But here, because it's right there in front of you, it really enhances the you know, the entire process. So what I've learned, right? A couple of formats, and I kind of fly through these. I've done this a couple of different ways. You know, the first attempts, were marrying self-guided discovery at the end of RAP. And why that made so much sense is because the Wellness Recovery Action Plan is a powerful tool for individuals. They do it themselves with, you know, with help, and it creates a personal profile so deep and so thorough that nothing that I've ever done in just discovery alone has ever created a profile like that. And plus there are parts of RAP that just automatically just jump over into discovery. Like, for instance, one of the things in RAP is people ask, you're asked, tell me about what you're like when you're most well, and when you're your best you, right? And people describe that. And then you might say, well, what do you do? What are you doing when you're your best you? And or if things start to slip and you're not feeling so hot, what do you do to knock you back on track? You know, and what are the tools, what are the things you do? And so, for instance, a friend of mine told me in RAP that one of the things that she does as a wellness tool is quilting. So pardon me, when she gets, you know, out of whack and she wants to, she needs to get back in, you know, in control, she'll just step aside and, you know, go home and do some quilting. And so I said, well, what do you know, I don't know anything about quilting, so what do you have to do to quilt? And she talked about, you know, it has a cut, you know, I have to sew, I have to measure and all this. Well, those are skills, right? And you come at skills in a much more benign way than say, what are your skills? Some of the other things that people do in RAP is they identify what triggers them. You know, what's the thing that really sets you off, that, you know, puts you in a downward spiral. And those triggers can jump right over to become conditions of employment. So in the RAP discovery thing, one of the best things that ever happened was one guy that was in there who was sort of challenging me all the time and then when I did my own themes map, like, the world changed for him. He completely had a different attitude about me, which told me a lot about the role of the facilitator. Anyway, so here's this guy, really a smart guy, struggled with mental health and chemical addiction and things like that. And long story short, you know, he does themes map and all that, and gets it in his head that he could go to college. He always wanted to, and so he started out going to one of the local technical colleges and getting a 2-year degree. And he finished a 2-year degree, and now he's in a 4-year college, and he's on his path to getting his degree in psychology, and he wants to move on to get a master's degree. Prior to that, people would tell him you can't do that because you know you're broken or whatever it was. The other one where that map photograph came from was done with families and individuals, and these were people who really didn't have many resources in the system. So self-guided was appealing to them, and so that fellow that did that map, he's on his path to to pursuing some other things. But again, it taught me a different format, and what it told me more than anything is that this has to be about doing stuff. That you just can't ask people, and they've got to do things. They got to write things. They got to do things. They got to draw things. They got to be active, and it's the active part that really gets people going. Which people? Anybody. I've done it with folks in the mental health world. I've done it with folks who have chemical dependency. I've done it with folks who are on the intellectual disability world, people on the autism spectrum. They all approach it a little bit differently, but the process is the same. Again, facilitation, I won't talk much about that because really in the world of facilitation, it's all there, but don't be in charge. But you have to push the process, but you're really not in charge, and it's a delicate balance. So, and what are our next steps? I mean, our next steps are to do it more, but I also believe that one of the next steps that we should pursue is sort of, I don't know, sort of a grandiose thing about having a national sort of format for facilitation. And so one of the things that I'd be interested to know is, like, if we held if we trained people how to do this, we went there and went and did that, would that be something that folks would be interested in? So again, like I said, we're all in this together, and that's me, and whew, that was a lot in a short period of time.
No, thank you so much, Bob. That was just great. Just so much useful information, and there have been questions coming in, so we'll get to those in a little bit. We now want to really have a discussion with you, Bob, and our panelists, who include Chantel Brown, who we introduced earlier from Arkansas, and Christopher Button, who is the supervisor of the Workforce System Policy Team at the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris for a moment to say a few words. Chris, do you want to?
Hi, Rebecca, and hi, Bob, and hi to our other speakers and to everyone who's on listening in today. Apologies for not being here earlier. We were having a little bit of technology problem, but I was listening on the phone, and now we've been able to connect in. Bob, I am going to be sharing what you just said with a whole group of people here at CODEP, because what you have done is tied this process beautifully to things that multiple teams might be working on, or it just shows beautifully the relevance to stay at work, return to work, people with varying disabilities. Really just a wonderful introduction to our conversation today. And I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the Office of Disability Employment Policy. We are thrilled that our speakers are here. We are thrilled that people are listening into the webinar. It's really exciting from a federal perspective to see how the idea of discovery is flourishing now. We hear from it from multiple different federal agencies. They want to know about it. It's in the WIOA now, so people, it's been kind of brought into their reference and to their consciousness. And these webinars and the question and answer periods that we're going to be going into are going to be so useful for us to share both federally and also with stakeholders across the country. So thank you, Rebecca, for organizing this great webinar today, and thank you, everyone, for being here. And I'm going to get off so that we can get on to this next part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And, and now we're looking forward to hearing from Chantel and Bob, and Chris may want to weigh in also. We had some questions that we thought that people who are listening to the webinar might be interested in hearing about, and they do reflect some of the questions that have been coming in the chat box or in the Q&A box. We encourage you to keep sending questions, and hopefully we'll get to them, get to all of them. If not, we'll try and respond to them offline. So the first thing that we thought it would be important to cover is to really hear from Chantel and Bob about what some of the settings are where you've used self-guided discovery, and who are some of the populations that you've worked with. You know, as Bob talked about, as we talked about in the beginning, there are different approaches to discovery and customized employment, some where people need more intensive support, where they benefit more if it's one-on-one or working in a group. As Bob said, there can be a group aspect to self-guided discovery, but we'd be interested in hearing from Bob and Chantel about, you know, some of the settings that they have used it in or would consider using it in, and with whom. And maybe we can start with Chantel. Again, Chantel works in the workforce system in Arkansas. Chantel?
Ma'am, good afternoon, everyone. In the Central Arkansas area, we have utilized the self-guided discovery on 2 different projects. And the first project that I'm going to talk to you about is a Tucker Prison project. It was a pilot project that we partnered with a faith-based group that was going in for pre-release candidates. So during this project, it ran from January of 2016 to July of 2016. We served 63 pre-release candidates. So they were within 6 months of being released back into the workforce and looking for assistance and stuff outside of where they were at Tucker Prison. So what we did is we utilized the self-guided discovery as a handout and a tool for the job seekers, and then along with other resources. So what we had basically is we attended Tucker Prison every other week, 2 times a month pretty much. And during those times, we actually made copies of the self-guided discovery pages. We made booklets for everyone. And then we utilized that tool for them to go from week to week like a stepping stone over the 6 months. And it was effective. We had to customize it a little bit, but we had a captive audience. We were not able to get feedback post-release to show the effectiveness of it. That was something that we were not able to do with this particular project. But like I said, they were a captive audience. What we found is that they did the homework that assigned to them. When we talked about their personal profile, or we talked about the skill sets that they had and the skill sets that they were wanting to attain, it generated great conversation. It made them think outside the box. There was a little bit of, hey, I have hope when I get out of this situation, and so I will be able to secure employment. And so that's how we utilized it in a group setting. We love the flexibility of the self-guided discovery tool. I love the fact that we were able to customize it to the needs of our individuals, of our targeted audience, and also they were able to look through it, like the financial part, and thinking about things at home when they were doing, like where do you go to the grocery store? That wasn't applicable to them at the moment, so we were not able, you know, we customized it and took that part out as far as the group process, but they got to think about that when they planned their activities home and they had their pre-release connections with their probation officers or parole officers. So they were able to utilize this tool during that process and then take it with them. Now, the second project that we used is we are currently using it. It's in our Delta regional area, Delta area. We have 3 counties that are very low income, and so that's our target audience. And we're doing this as a self-discovery where we want people that come into the Workforce Center to see this customized approach and self-approach. So the difference between the two, excuse me, is they're not a captive audience. So a lot of times we don't see the feedback and the follow-through on homework that when we talk to them about, we want you to come back next week, we want you to go to this employer and go to this employer and do your interview. A lot of times we don't get feedback where we did in the group setting. We're not sure of the effectiveness of it yet. We've got a few placements from the individuals that have utilized the tool, but they don't necessarily bring us the tool back and say this is how we've utilized that. Again, the flexibility is great. You can hit the high points, especially if we are not sure if the candidate will return, if the job seeker will return. They still have this tool to look at. So those are the two ways in Central Arkansas that we have utilized this tool to date. One of the ways we would consider using this is in our out-of-school youth population with WIOA. We have the out-of-school youth program and in-school youth program, and I think this would be a great tool to use for those school programs through WIOA.
Well, thank you so much, Chantal. Those projects sound really, really exciting, and it's nice to hear that that people are getting outcomes from it. I want to ask the same question to Bob, and Bob, I saw that in the questions that have come through, people have asked if it could be applicable even with younger students, like with, I mean, Chantal, is thinking about in-school and out-of-school youth, but someone asked about would you even want to start as early as middle school. So I thought maybe you could weigh in on that when you're responding to who you might use this with and what are some of the settings that you might use it in.
Yeah, well, I kind of touched on a lot of this, pardon me, a lot of the people, like it could be anybody, so I don't think I need to go into that. But my only, I absolutely think that with young folks, with kids, I'm at an age now where everybody's a young folk to me, but for like I have a granddaughter who's 8, and a grandson who's 16, and I can't see any reason why my daughter can't start helping them think through this, right? I mean, and so I don't know necessarily that. I mean, it could be done with teachers. I don't know. It wasn't something that we really thought about. I think one of the cool things of what Chantal said that's really important is she said that we're gonna kind of customize it, and I think that's really an important feature, that customizing means customizing. Now, there's a point in customizing this process or customizing using the tool where the only thing that I would say is you can't skip steps, right? You really can't. I mean, it was designed sort of to flow intentionally, to take you from, the start to employment. But if you're going to be doing that over the course of years, I mean, a lot of what I would do with young kids is I'd really focus on the skills. I would try to introduce kids to different things that people do, and don't ask them if they want to do that for a living, but to ask them what they think about it, and how does that look? Does that look like it's something you'd be interested in doing, not to make money, but to do, like we have here in Minneapolis, we have the Mill City Museum, which is, it's all, Minneapolis was a milling town for flour and things like that, and the old General Mills mill blew up. And so on the site of the old mill, they created this museum. And all of my grandkids, and my kids too, when they were in school, went there. And one of the things they got to do when they went on a school trip was to go down and make bread or something. They would, with Pillsbury dough or whatever, and just getting their hands on it and trying something. It gave them that experience of doing things. So I think that's what I would really focus on with young folks, was getting them experiences, hands-on kinds of experiences, and then once they get a catalog of what those things are, I think how they feel about it. Well, you start to see those trends and take it into a more in-depth as the person gets older. The other thing that I think is really an important piece that you could do with kids, whether they be really young or in high school or starting high school, is to have them, ask them to interview 10 people that their family knows, and ask them what they do for a living and how they got into it, and what advice they'd give somebody who was interested in that same sort of field, and just do that. It can't be all family members. It needs to be a kind of more diverse group. And then the part 2 of that assignment is go out and meet with 10 small businesses owner-owned businesses in your community. Maybe your family does business with, maybe it's a garage, maybe it's a barber, whatever, and ask them the same question. So now you have these young folks that have found out 20 different things about what people do for a living. And again, it gives them a much broader perspective. So I think those are a couple of things that might work for young folks.
Thanks so much, Bob. That's really useful and practical and doable. A lot of the questions that are coming in are about how to introduce this with young people. So I think that's enormously helpful. Maybe we can go to the next question now. And Bob has talked a lot about facilitator do's and don'ts. And the guide, when you all download the facilitator's guide or have a chance to look at it on the Lead Center site, it gives a lot of guidance for facilitators in terms of do's and don'ts. But facilitators really are in a position to make this successful or not. And Bob already has shared a number of recommendations and things to stay away from. I know Chantel has been involved in using it in a number of projects over a period of time. So maybe, Chantel, if you wouldn't mind starting, are there some things that you've learned as part of the process that you've found helpful in introducing this or in facilitating the process?
I think it's important to remember that we're all in this together, and I think we see better results when agencies and they work as teams. We have found that to be very effective when you engage. We have had a lot of luck engaging our faith-based community with the particular ones that we did one-on-one that produced great success stories. We found when we look back over that we included a large number of people to help that person be successful. So I think that's important, that when we look at individuals that we think community-wide, that it's important to engage the community.
No, that's so important. I think that's great. And I don't know what Bob would add to that, but I had a question that I had is that I heard you recommend strongly that for facilitators to be effective, they need to go through the self-guided discovery process themselves. And I think that you did that as part of a RAP group initially. And what do you recommend for people to, who are starting with this? Would they do it alone? Would they do it with a small group of people? Does it, are there benefits to one way or the other?
Well, I mean, I think you could do it alone because you have that. However, even like when I went back and talked about What Color Is Your Parachute, right? When it's a book that been written 20-some years ago, maybe 30 years ago, and he really strongly advocates for involving other people. So essentially what you would do is like I would suggest fill out the stuff that's in the workbook, and then have your friends over for coffee or something. Say, what do you think? And what advice would you give me? I think that always works best. Just doing it by yourself will at least give you some sense of what you're looking for and how to kind of answers that you might find. But it's always those things where it's that person that doesn't say anything, and they're sitting there listening to you, and then all of a sudden they say this one thing, and it's like the most profound thing anybody ever said, and you go, boy, I never would have thought of that, So I think that's I would always recommend sharing, having other people and trusted people. Your friends aren't going to lie to you. They're going to want to support you. So I would go through the process and try doing it yourself. I think what it does, Rebecca and everybody, is it creates it helps keep you humble. And I think that's a really important piece as a facilitator in this process, because you're dealing with people's lives here, and you're dealing with people's, whatever, their frustrations, their emotions and all that. And so we really need to be humble. We need to have a sense of humility about this, that we are not in charge of this. We are helping, and I think that's a big key.
No, that's really useful, and I loved what Chantel said about partnering with places in the community, people in the community, faith-based organizations. And we have heard really successful stories of people working through community-based organizations, Centers for Independent Living, so that the process doesn't have to be owned by a state system. It doesn't have to be eligibility-based or anything like that. Some of the questions are asking, how to get it started with young people, and certainly reaching out to parents and families to start that, as Bob has recommended, would be really strong. So thank you so much for those responses.
Rebecca, if I might add one thing to that, and again, I just would absolutely agree about the community and all. But one of the things that we're just at the beginning stages of here in Minnesota is working in partnership with ARC Minnesota and what the idea is to create I think 4 cohorts around the state of Minnesota. Well, if you know anything about Minnesota, it's a big place. I mean, it's a lot. There's a lot of area here, but the idea is starting to create sort of these creating communities of parents where I can't find them because they're data privacy and those kinds of things, but they're connected to ARC, and ARC knows them, and ARC can throw that out, and so that's where we're headed in trying to develop resource people who can be either guides for self-guided discovery or at least someone who's willing to come and sit and listen, that kind of thing. So yeah, the community is critical. They hold the answers. Right.
Yeah, and I think leveraging the groups that exist that already pull those people together, it is really important. Now, that's great. I'm going to move on to question 3. Because I think it's a really critical one, and we've talked about it a little bit. So given the way that self-guided discovery is designed, how do you think of it as a universal design? I mean, we've heard of it being used in a pre-release program with job seekers with multiple kinds of disabilities, with youth and adults, and in what ways do you see it as a universally designed approach that really could benefit anyone? And maybe again, I'll start with Chantal.
Sure. I think the flexibility of the tool is very impressive, and the way it flows just has a natural flow to it, and it asks. The language that is used in the tool is a people-first language, and there's not a lot of government language and, acronyms and things like that. And I think, especially like as a workforce system, we have to be cautious of that because we want to be able to communicate with our job seekers in a way that they understand, in the way that will produce success for them. So I like the language of the tool. I like the flexibility. I think it can be used for any demographic of people. I know that it was targeted for individuals with disabilities. We've had great success with our reentry. But if you think about our populations, from our dislocated workers to our single parents who may not have had a job, to our battered women's shelter who may have been sheltered and not been allowed to work for those years, this is a project and a tool that can be used for them to think about, and I think it gives hope to people. I think that it allows them to think outside the box and not just think, okay, well, I don't want to do, nurse, teacher, all of the occupations in demand that we may think about. It allows them to think outside the box. So I love those aspects of utilizing the tool.
No, that's great. Thank you. And I wanted to turn back to Chris Button, because Chris Button really has been the person who has introduced customized employment as a universal design in general, since its inception, and, has supported us in bringing this self-guided discovery strategy to the workforce system and to all the partners. And Chris, how would you respond to the question about how you think this is applicable as a universal design?
Well, first I would say that I totally agree with what Bob and Chantal have said, that the different populations that have just been spoken about today on the webinar document its potential usefulness. But when we first started talking about discovery, Rebecca, and working with the LEAD Center to help partner with organizations like Griffin-Hammis and Mark Gold and others to develop the discovery materials, it was with the idea in mind that this is a step to achieving customized employment, and that customized employment is a universal employment strategy. In fact, a book was put out a number of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, called Workforce of One, and it was published by Harvard Business Press by a couple of generic mainstream human resource professionals. And one of the basic tenets of their book was that the best employers of the future, the places where people are really going to want to work, and this had nothing to do with disability, this was just the generic mainstream work world, are going to be employers who utilize the strengths of their employees and really customize around those strengths. It was like, whoa, they're talking about customized employment for the mainstream world. And when you think about it, to the extent that employers are embracing and doing customization with their workforce to get the best out of their workforce, it's going to be even easier for them to bring in to that workforce people with barriers. It's not something separate and special and different that they would be doing for someone with a disability, or someone who is an ex-offender, or someone who might be coming out of a battered woman situation, or maybe someone who's an ESL speaker, English as a second language, or maybe somebody has stay-at-home parents who are aging and they just need to work their life a little differently. There are just so many ways that this can be useful, and that was the intent. That as managers, we kind of do that anyway. We look at our staff and we think, how can I get the best out of the staff person? What is going to really get their juices flowing? And a lot of times we do that after they're already hired. And with customized, we're talking about doing it before, going through this discovery process, or maybe somebody has sustained an injury and there's a need to do some adjustments to what they're doing in order to maintain them as a valued employee. So I guess that's a long answer to your question, Rebecca. Absolutely. We do this as a universal design strategy in order to achieve a universal design employment relationship between an employer and a job seeker.
No, thank you so much, Chris. That was just great. And actually, since we only have a couple minutes left, that's just a wonderful way to kind of sum up what this whole process is about. We wanted to let you know, as part of the slide deck, which will be posted on the website along with the transcript and the materials, we wanted to give you links to previously held webinars on customized employment. So that's a link there. I mentioned the guided group discovery materials and webinars that we've done previously, so we've provided a link to that. Those are all available free for download. And like the self-guided discovery facilitator's guide, they're very intuitive. It walks you through step-by-step what you can do, how you can go through the process, provides you with do's and don'ts, gives you examples. We gave you a link to essential elements of customized employment for universal application. This was a collaborative process by the Federal Rehabilitation Services Administration and Griffin-Hammis Associates and Mark Gold Associates and Transcend to call out what's most important in customized employment and discovery and employer engagement. It's a wonderful document, especially if you're doing training or you're trying to introduce it to people. LEAD Center has an entire portion of its website on customized employment that has a lot of resources that you would find useful from people who've been doing this for a long time, very practical for people who are in the field. We've actually responded to I think, most of the questions as part of the other responses. We wanted to mention that there's a webinar series coming up on AJC certification and Section 188, which is the equal opportunity provisions of WIOA. a window of opportunity to impact equal opportunity policy and practice for people with disabilities. Bob mentioned that on April 18th, we'll be doing a webinar on advancing financial literacy for individuals with disabilities, and on it, there will be people from a number of places, a number of federal agencies and disability organizations. There'll be a lot of resources that are available, also free for download, to help people develop financial literacy skills and connect to work incentives and things like that. We've provided a slide just on all the ways that you can connect with the LEAD Center. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or need additional information, and especially if you start to use the materials and you have questions or want to tell us about your successes, you know, we'd be thrilled to hear about that. Thank you all for being part of this. A special thanks to Bob Nemec and Chantel Brown and Christopher Button for all of the great information that you provided. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Bye.